Thank you guys so much for being here, and thanks to the people in the Integrative Medicine Club and AMOPS for hosting this session. They are the reason you guys are eating pizza right now, so give them a little love. And we'll get started on talk number 3 of this series, which is going to be discussing history of medicine and referring back to our prior talks, but focusing this time on a little bit of how diseases were diagnosed, but more on how treatment changed over time. And we'll have a little bit of common ground with the prior talks, but we should have some interesting and occasionally horrifying things to throw at you for the history of medicine leading up to today. So let's jump back to Egypt once again. So the Ebers and Edwin Smith papyri have given us a pretty good idea about the pharmacy that was available in Egypt, and they had a lot. They had different extracts, nuts, herbs. In particular, they had kind of synthesized opium from the poppy. They had ice, they had alcohol, and they would use these in treatment. My personal favorite there is turpentine, so think of a medical excuse to use turpentine on somebody and get back to me when you have an idea about how that goes. But essentially, the Egyptians had a very well developed pharmacopoeia. It doesn't mean it was effective, but they had a lot of things that they would use to try to help people heal, in addition to the temple-based healing that was popular at the temples of Imhotep. The Greeks not only adopted that temple-based healing, but also brought some of the pharmacy from Egypt into the ancient Greek world. Didn't tend to work any better there than it did before, but it worked well enough, or at least people tended to get better to a degree that people didn't blame the physicians and the stuff that they were using on them. Now, Hippocrates, we've talked a lot about, he had the theory that the health and makeup of the body were controlled by the 4 humors: air, fire, earth, water, and that their balance or imbalance would cause health or disease. Now, in addition to that theory, he also developed several treatments that involved pharmacy, but also things like manipulation, massage, enemas, cupping, bleeding. And I particularly like the picture at the bottom. It's a Hippocratic table. I guess they would do a spinal adjustment on somebody. So you can compare that to the table that's up against the wall in the OPP lab. Not quite the same. We don't have to strap anyone's head into the table in the OPP lab. But manipulation and massage were actually in the medical practice at the time, but fell out of practice, at least in normal physician-based medicine, up until about the where we are right now, the common era now. These kind of treatments were considered to be heroic treatments, and the common use of the term heroic treatment means a treatment that is actually damaging to the patient. So the disease is hurting you, but I'm going to hurt you in a way that makes it better. Now, you'd think that would be more akin to surgery, but it came to be used in reference to pharmaceutical treatments that made people ill. So giving them some poison to fight off some other poison became termed heroic treatments. And you'll hear that term occasionally. And pretty much everything from ancient Greece up until about the 1900s fits into that model. So Galen, we've talked a lot about as well, developed the humoral theory, wedded it with the pneumatic theory about how air cycles through the body, gets transmitted into the brain and then the nerves. He, shockingly, did not really write or contribute a whole lot in regards to treatment. The treatments he had were roughly conventional for the ones at the time. He elaborated on them but didn't really make any major changes, unlike his contributions to anatomy, physiology, and surgery. So he basically towed the line with the Hippocratic treatments and passed those on to posterity. But because he was so widely read, those treatments remained in use for a very long time. Now, one new person is another Greek, like Galen, living in the Roman era, and he has a kind of a weird name. His first name is Roman, and his second name is Greek. So that would be our buddy Pedasius Dioscorides, and he served in the Roman army in the 1st century AD under the Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero probably wasn't leading the army. He wasn't known for that sort of stuff. Fiddling while Rome burned didn't actually happen, but that's roughly what his reputation is all about. Essentially, Dioscorides followed the army, collected botanical preparations, and recorded them in a comprehensive manual called De Materia Medica, or On Medical Materials. Fun fact is, up until about 50 years ago, there were not pharmacology courses in medical school. They were called materia medica. So that was actually kind of a shorthand for pharmacy in general. He didn't talk about synthetic preparations as much as he talked about botanical preparations. And one thing that's very nice is a lot of his copies that were made of this book had very good illustrations, such as we see here. It's a copy that's currently in Vienna that would show people what the plants were and how to extract and prepare them for treatment of people. Now, this book remained in use until the 17th century in active use in classrooms. It was very authoritative, did a good job of organizing the plants and where they were found, and was actually referred to by Linnaeus when he was actually trying to come up with the different distinctions for where animals and plants fit into his system. And just fun fact, I just thought I'd go check this out. This book was never rediscovered or kind of brought back to prominence in the Renaissance like many other works because it's never been out of print. It's always been in use. And I went on Amazon earlier today and just took a screen cap of the fact you can go buy a copy right now. So not too bad. 2,000 years of being in print. Pretty decent track record for Dioscorides there. Now, we talked already about how the fall of the Roman Empire brought about a shift in high culture and high learning areas from the Mediterranean into the Middle East. So Constantinople, Damascus, and Baghdad became very famous places where scholars congregated, taught, and experimented. Now, most of the time, up until now, I've discussed how the Islamic scholars and physicians did a lot of cataloging, but not a great deal of development in regards to things like surgery and anatomy. But when it comes to chemistry, botany, pharmaceuticals, astronomy, the Islamic scholars were really, really strong practitioners of those arts and not only kept what came to them from classic sources, but elaborated on them, did active research, and made them much stronger. In particular, chemistry got a very strong start in the Islamic empires, particularly under one person, Rhazes or Al-Razi, who developed a theory at the time that got a good deal of traction that all substances were based around their ratio of sulfur and mercury, and that the ratio of those is what gave different metals and different elements their properties. Alchemy really did lead into modern chemistry. Now, when you guys hear the term alchemy, what's the first thing that jumps to your mind? Very good, Sorcerer's Stone. Thank you, J.K. Rowling. Now, what did the Sorcerer's Stone do? There were two main goals that people attribute to most alchemists back in these eras. What did the Sorcerer's Stone do? You can refer to Harry Potter if you wish. It did what? If you had the Sorcerer's Stone, you would be immortal. It would keep you alive forever. The other big goal that alchemists sought after was transmutation of base elements into gold or other valuable elements. And because the theory was that it was a ratio of mercury and sulfur, there was no reason that we shouldn't be able to transmute one to another by changing that ratio. The atomic theory was not something that was in active use at the time, although some prefigurations of atomic theory had existed in ancient Greece. But the idea that elements were distinct and relatively immutable was not something that was present at the time. So alchemy was operating under a weird paradigm by our contemporary standards, but it brought about modern chemistry in that the processes of refining, extracting, distilling substances from other structures and changing them in some way created not only chemical tools, chemical experiments, but led to an experimental mindset. And when chemistry fully came in, it was mostly because it developed off of alchemy. It wasn't something that replaced alchemy. It was really an outgrowth of it. So the great thing that Rhazes did was not only did he address medical topics and how chemistry or alchemy could be of use in medicine, he did it in an experimental way. It wasn't strictly referring to texts and prior authorities. He actually looked into how things were done and recorded his results, something that we don't see developing in Europe until about the 1500s. The other big name in regards to pharmacy was Avicenna, or Avicenna. He was a massively prolific scholar, did works on philosophy, mathematics, theology, and medicine. And in medicine, his major contribution was called the Canon of Medicine. canon in the same sense that canon law is something that's pretty much the official standard of how things are done. So the Canon of Medicine was 5 volumes that he put together, dealing with a lot of topics, but in regard to pharmacy, pharmacology, he elaborated on about 800 natural or simple preparations, things that were distillable from botanical sources, maybe animal products. And then in the last book, he elaborated on, what's the number? It is 650 compound sources, so compounding things to bring them together. And when we mix drugs these days, in a compounding pharmacy, we're taking more than one preparation and putting it into a single pill or mixture for its use. So that compounding's been with us for a long time. And not surprisingly, the canon of medicine was in use until the 18th century, so it was similarly long-lived. Now, this is mostly because he didn't just collect medical information. Avicenna really worked hard to bring Galenic, humoral anatomy, physiology, and treatment into accord with Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had a ridiculously complicated but comprehensive system of how the natural world worked, and by wedding Aristotle to Galen, Avicenna made both of them that much more authoritative. And when Galen and Aristotle made it into the Middle Ages in Europe and the Renaissance thereafter, they were that much more well respected because both of those authorities were brought into agreement with each other. All right. Now, one thing that was interesting regarding Avicenna's work is that the goal was still to balance the humors. If I had a fever, my body was actually trying to get me back to health by burning off some excessive heat or getting rid of some excessive humor that was there. And the physician's job was to assist the body in that process. However, one thing Avicenna did by bringing in Aristotle was really popularize the idea that all of us have a different humoral makeup. And that humoral makeup could be, I'm more caloric, or I'm more sanguine than somebody else, or somebody born at one time would be more phlegmatic, they'd be slower, a little more watery, and that the treatment for me would be very different from the treatment for you for the exact same problem, because our humoral differences would have to be taken into account. Now, fun fact, these humoral differences were theorized to exist because at the time we were born, or while we were developing in the womb, the planets and stars would work their magic on us, and whichever ones happened to be the most pronounced or most in ascendance at that time would actually change the makeup of us as we would be developing. And my differences could be because Mercury was in ascendant while I was developing, where somebody else would have Venus in ascendant during their time. So this marrying of astrology, which is different from astronomy, astrology to medicine was another thing that Avicenna really brought into prominence. Now, fun fact, when you guys think of astrology, what do you guys think of? The newspaper? Horoscopes, yeah. Somebody being paid a little bit of money to come up with some very generalized statements. You will have an interesting week. Oh, it's like they know me. Oh. But at the time, these astrological horoscopes were very specific, and people would pay a great deal of money to have very particular astrological charts drawn up for them and their family members to see what sort of things would be advisable for them to do to stay healthy and so forth. Now, one thing you probably didn't think of was the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel, I don't know if anyone here is a biblical scholar, but does anyone have an idea of what the original description of the Tower of Babel was? It was a tower that reached up to the, starts with an H, heavens, thank you. Now the ziggurats, the actual towers that were present in the Babylonian and Assyrian cities, weren't really that tall. They weren't built tall, but on their top were astrological signs. Not quite astrolabes, but things that would actually help them chart the movement of the stars, the planets, and so forth. So it's theorized that when we're talking about these towers that reached up to the heavens, the Tower of Babel was not just a tall tower, it was a tower that had astrological and astronomical forecasts kind of on it that people would use. So astrology, and as a result, eventually astronomy, had been practiced since the dawn of humanity. We can't really know when those started. So it's not that that Avicenna and others just came up with this. This is a really old historical development. But even though astrology is considered bunk these days, the fact is those data were being collected, recorded, and allowed astronomy to develop, just as chemistry developed out of alchemy. So, back in Europe, we've talked about this already. What was going on? Roman Empire had fallen. The Frankish and Germanic kingdoms really were not considered high-status places of learning, and it was very difficult to get any development going there. The Middle Eastern authorities were considered to be really reputable, and people went out of their way not only to gather sources from Islamic scholars, but to actually not even plagiarize. If I had a work I wanted to be taken seriously back then, I'd actually adopt a Middle Eastern sounding name so people would take it seriously. Interesting, right? So, the physicians kept up that Greek idea that mental labor and manual labor were two completely different things, and that mental labor was far, far preferable to manual labor. And if anybody was here for the first talk, who were the people who did all the manual labor of medicine? They weren't the physicians, they were the barbers or the barber surgeons. They're people who gathered the urine, sewed up the cuts, cut the hair, pulled the teeth, did the actual bleeding and venesection on people when bleeding was called for. And the physicians basically tried to keep themselves at arm's distance from any actual treatment, aside from looking at the wheel of urine right there in the middle. So urine was considered to be one of the diagnostic tools that people would use to see whether someone was healthy or not. So the next talk will be all about the history of surgery, and I'm just giving this as a quick little teaser for that. The barbers and barber surgeons were actually set to be some of the most influential and experimentally capable people at this time. They did the actual work, they made actual observations, and they could actually see what things did work and what things didn't. The problem was the Council of Tours basically was held, and the Pope declared that priests, monks, and other literate people would no longer be allowed to do surgery. And if those are the only literate people, that means only the illiterate, low-status people will be practicing it, and it becomes a craft art, something that doesn't really gather information, transmit information, and elaborate on things. So surgery was really primed to take off, but then it hit this little bump and became static for quite a while. A little bit of work was done in France around the time of the 1300s, but it didn't really take off until after Vesalius and others adopted a more experimental approach to anatomy, allowing surgery to move forward. We talked about the barber pole. Now, a little more detail on the Black Death, presumed to be the bubonic plague. The Black Death, or as it was called at the time, the Great Mortality, started roughly somewhere in Mongolia. The fleas that carry the bubonic plague tend to be rat fleas, and made the jump to humans. And once it was in humans, further spread by fleas could occur, but humans could also spread it directly. You could have the bubonic form, where your lymph nodes expanded, enlarged, and would sometimes rupture, having a lot of purulent material and infective material therein. You could have the septic form, which wasn't as transmittable and almost mercifully, it could be lethal within about 24 hours. So you could go from super healthy to dead in 24 hours with the septic form. And then the pneumatic form was the most infective. It was actually aerosolized, and if I coughed on you and I had that pneumatic form of plague, guess what? You've got it now too. So it made the jump from Mongolia into the Mediterranean area because the Mongols put a siege on the city of Kaffa, where there was a trading post of Italians, mostly Genoese, and the plague broke out in the Mongolian camp. They had to give up the siege. But before they left, they used some trebuchets and catapults to heave the bodies of plague victims into Kaffa. First act in recorded history of biological warfare. And the Genoese took it back to Italy, stopping off at Sicily and some other places along the way. And from there, it made a very slow counterclockwise rotation through Europe, spreading more slowly into the colder areas. I think Iceland was probably the last place to get it for obvious reasons. It's an island and it's very cold. But it worked its way back to Russia. And the interesting thing about the spread of plague is that it happened by jumping from port to port. It also spread overland, but that spread was very slow. It was commerce that really brought the plague from place to place. So what did people do about it? Well, essentially, plague was blamed on all the lists of things that you'd expect. But the one theory that had the most traction at the time was called miasma theory. Now, we mentioned it already. What does miasma mean? What's a rough translation of miasma? Bad air. And bad air was blamed on the planets, once again. Certain conjunctions of the planets, the sun and the moon, could cause bad air to form and develop underground. And when earthquakes happened, they released that bad air, which would cause disease. Now, this is not as ridiculous as it sounds. Anyone who's got family in mining, is mining a difficult and dangerous job? What kind of things can happen in a mine involving your airway? Not just black lung. There can be pockets of gas, and sometimes when people would open mine shafts, even back then, people would suffocate and die, presumably not because they thought CO2 was there, but because there was bad air trapped underground, and that when earthquakes released it, it went and spread. And that was the theory of miasma. Now, it doesn't hold up by our contemporary accounts, but I challenge you, starting with nothing, come up with something better than that. It's really not a terrible explanation. It's just not right, but it's not a bad explanation. The main problem we address over and over in these talks is the lack of willingness to experiment and discard old theories once they're proven to be ineffective. So we'll see lots and lots of that. So, inadvertently, the plague doctor suit became extremely effective, but not for the reasons that they thought of at the time. This basically is a walking hazmat suit in the medieval parlance. They had the mask, the hat, a cloak, basically waders, like fishing waders, boots, gloves, all made of boiled or oiled leather. And in the beak, they had herbs and other, let's just say, strong smelling, plants, herbs, spices, things that smelled strong. Because if bad air makes you sick, the good air can drive that bad air away and make it better. One quick aside, there was also the theory that bad air could be driven out by other bad air. And there was actually a vogue in places that were under the plague of going to public latrines and really letting the waft come in. It's like, well, this may smell terrible, but I'm not going to get plague if I'm just standing over the public latrine for a while. So next time you go into a really nasty gas station bathroom, just give yourself that thought, I'm not getting plague, I'm not getting plague. It won't make it any more pleasant, but it'll distract you long enough to get the job done. So the plague doctor mask was actually there to hold those herbs and those spices and other things so that they could keep the good air next to their face, but also so they didn't have to hold it up next to their face with their hand. It allowed them to keep their hands free, and the bird face kind of beaked appearance became the standard appearance of the plague doctor suit. So it worked. It helped keep fleas and other infective material off the physician. It just didn't work for the reason that they thought it did. So, after the fall of Damascus, Baghdad, and later Constantinople, the scholars in those places fled back to the west into Europe and took up residence in the universities, which had recently come into being. The universities were really crazy for more authentic translations of Aristotle, Galen, Pliny the Elder, other authorities that they'd only had in translation of translation of translation of translation. So when these scholars brought more direct translations to these universities, it became a real spark that relit the Renaissance. However, the distinction between manual and mental was still going very strong. Now, not that it's that much different from what you guys do day in and day out, but what's everybody doing right here? What's open in front of everybody? Books. What's the professor looking at? Books. It was all about transmitting information as received from one to the next. It wasn't really about experimentation. So next time you guys think about the anatomy lab, yeah, it smells bad. Yeah, it can be tough, but it's an actual experience that's something other than here's what we want you to know. You have the opportunity to actually see what's there and verify it for yourself. One reason I love my field so much is because there's that little moment of authenticity to it. Like, yeah, these muscles are there, go look. Yeah. And if you find something weird, that doesn't mean anatomy is invalid. It means, oh wow, cool variant, we'll take a look at it. So these high status, high authority physicians took up residence in the universities and large towns and largely had their practice unchanged. Bleeding, cupping, enemas, purgatives, looking at urine, prescribing different not really pharmacology in our current sense, but different pharmacologic treatments to deal with illness. It didn't change much from the medieval state up until about the 1800s, largely because these physicians were very high status, they were relatively beyond question, and one thing that's a little more subtle, they had a very flexible intellectual system to work in. Now that sounds like a good thing, but in some senses it's not. If I have a patient and I prescribe some medicine and that patient dies, that should be a cue that maybe I should look into why it didn't work. But if I can just immediately go to, I guess he was more bilious than sanguine and that's why it didn't work, I've just given myself an easy out. And that flexibility in the system prevented real critical thinking about how medicine was practiced for quite a while. So, some developments that came along in the Enlightenment following the Renaissance was a proliferation of something really interesting, imponderable fluids, meaning fluids or things that flowed that we couldn't really touch or taste or sense, but they were really there. So these imponderable fluids, there are a variety of them. Now my personal favorite is phlogiston. Has anyone ever heard of phlogiston? There we go. Phlogiston was the theoretical fluid that made things burn. So if I had a log, it was soaked with phlogiston, and I throw it on a fire, and it's able to burn, and those ashes have been deflogginated. They're no longer having phlogiston in them, therefore they can't catch fire anymore. So it was a theoretical fluid that allowed things to burn. Another theoretical fluid was described by Galvani. It was called animal electricity. And Galvani was able to show that a dead frog's legs could be induced to contract, and the muscles could contract and spasm when he touched probes of different metals to them. Now, Volta came along and showed that animal electricity was actually just chemistry. It was the chemical that the probe made up, zinc or copper or some such, that actually caused those contractions to manifest. So, these imponderable fluids may not have existed in the way that the people at the time thought, but they led to some important things. For example, there's another imponderable fluid called electrical fire. And it is the basis for our entire civilization today. Electricity is what we grew out from electrical fire. And the major mover and shaker in describing and moving it forward was Benjamin Franklin. So I like this picture here. I'm not quite sure there were that many cherubs and angels present at the time that Franklin had the key experiment. There's actually a theory that he made his illegitimate son actually hold the kite in the electrical storm to not to waylay the risk to him. So I like this picture. I like this one better. Here's Franklin dueling Zeus to bring electricity to humanity. So that's fun, but the fact that he's got Wolverine's claws makes it that much better. So thanks, Benjamin Franklin. Now, one other theoretical or imponderable fluid that was in vogue was called animal magnetism. And animal magnetism was the creation of a man named Franz Anton Mesmer. And if you've ever heard of someone being mesmerizing, or to mesmerize someone, that's his name. That word did not exist until he came along, and it's describing his treatments. So mesmerism was his theory of adjusting the animal magnetism that was flowing through people to make them healthy. And he felt that if you had a blockage of this animal magnetism, you would develop psychotic, nervous, or other psychological problems. And the interesting thing is, his treatments worked. He was actually able to help people through the adjustments of animal magnetism, and he got several hopeless cases, neurotic patients, very well He did a good job of treating people. He eventually started having huge mass treatments where he'd have people hold hands and one person would have an electrical charge or the other person would grab and it'd shock everybody. We actually did that at an anatomy retreat not too long ago. They had an old style electrical generator, and so all the anatomists in the room held hands and they touched it and everybody had a little jump. It was fun. Nobody had a heart attack. So Mesmer had some very interesting things going on. The problem was he was incredibly inflexible about why his techniques worked. He said it was because of animal magnetism and that's it. And he insisted that anyone using his methods adopt his theory that animal magnetism didn't just affect people, it affected the entire universe. And it was a very global, holistic theory about how the entire universe worked. And it was garbage. It wasn't really there. And his work was then discarded and not paid attention to up until much later when Sigmund Freud, and actually A.T. Still, adopted that idea of unblocking various kind of roadblocks to health in the body, or using those treatments and suggestive methods that Mesmer used, not for animal magnetism, but for hypnosis and therapy. And one interesting thing is when Mesmer was decreed to be basically unscientific and his work had no basis, that was decreed by a group of French scientists, including Benjamin Franklin, who happened to be in France at the time as the American diplomat, and as a famous scientist was brought in to adjudicate on whether mesmerism had anything really to it. So, assessing the health of patients is another thing that developed a little further on in the Enlightenment. This time in France, we had a couple big names. Jean-Michel Corvisart was the first who came up with the idea of percussion and actually assessing people's thoracic and abdominal cavities by tapping to see what sort of resonance they had. And if you have fluid in your abdomen, it's going to make a different sound than if you don't. If you have fluid or consolidation or pneumonia in your lungs, it's going to make a different sound. Have you guys done that in clinical skills? Some of you yes, some of you no. First years yes, first years no, second years yes. So when you do this percussion, you're actually listening to the resonance created, and that's telling you something about whether something is solid or airy. And he got the idea because his father was an innkeeper, and he'd assessed the state of his wine jugs by tapping on them. And so, Corvisart adopted the same idea to treating people. So, pretty good. Physical exam took a big step forward in the French hospitals and clinics of the day. Corvisart also actually came up with the idea of grand rounds, having everybody tour the floor and discuss the patients, their progress, and what the probable interventions ought to be. And he had a student, a guy with a great name, René Théophile Hyacinthe Laennec, who invented the stethoscope. And he invented the stethoscope because, like his name would suggest, he was a shy little flower of a man. He was very delicate, but a very dedicated and compassionate physician. But one day, in the middle of summer, he was asked to check the heart of a very obese, sweaty, unbathed prostitute who was in heart failure. And he just couldn't handle the thought of that. He just couldn't deal with it. And at the time, to hear someone's heart, that's what you did. You stuck your ear up to their chest and listened. So some stories say he actually fled the examining room and went outside. But as he was sitting, he thought about when they were kids, they would play a game where they'd hold a rolled up newspaper or a stick to something and somebody would tap and they'd be able to actually hear the transmission of sound through that. So he went back up to the examining room with a rolled up newspaper, put it to the woman's chest and listened. And he actually discovered that not only did it worked better than putting his ear to her chest. And being an amateur woodworker, he started crafting straight wooden stethoscopes that he then sold. If you bought his book, he would send you, for a little extra money, a hand-turned, lathe-turned stethoscope. And from that source, we now have the universal sign of, "Hi, I'm a doctor." So Laennec did a great deal of work thereafter on pneumatic diseases, tuberculosis, and sadly died of tuberculosis, which he contracted from working so closely with people with the disease. So one interesting aside, I don't have a slide for this, but the stethoscope is currently the big symbol for physician status. In the near future, I will actually be I'm forecasting it's going to be a little handheld stethoscope, like a tricorder from Star Trek. So if you're walking around with a stethoscope, that's okay. But if you're walking around with a sonogram, little sonography unit, that's going to be the big coming thing for physician status. I could be wrong, but I'm going to go there. Anybody want to take a guess at what the status symbol for physicians was prior to the stethoscope? Not the beak, although you're really close. Physicians after the plague still wanted to ward off bad miasmas, and so they carried around a gold cane. And that cane had a hollow top that was filled with spices and petals and things of that nature, and they'd walk around kind of like sniffing the end of their cane to keep all the bad smells at bay. And there's some great illustrations of all the physicians walking around with their canes, stuck up to their face as they're examining people and so forth. So stethoscope's probably better, although you can hit people with a cane and get them out of your way. So debatable. So we talked last time about how Edward Jenner was able to take the kind of urban legend, or at least rural legend at the time, that milkmaids never caught smallpox, and come up with the idea of inoculating people against smallpox by giving them cowpox. Now that was impressive in and of itself, but the person who next picked up that train of thought was Louis Pasteur. Now Louis Pasteur was not a physician, he's a chemist, but he became the most vociferous proponent of germ theory, basically making sure everyone knew that germ theory was real, it was effective, and you could do things with it. He disproved the idea of spontaneous generation by having meat left out with a little flask that had been sterilized and had a curved opening so that air could get in, but dust and other things could not. And he used his microscope to identify the bacteria that were present in putrid wine and beer, as well as the bacteria that were infesting the French silk industry. So the silkworms were actually dying because they had a bacterial infection. And he was able not only to identify those bacteria and distinguish them from yeast and other helpful organisms, but come up with ways to combat them and come up with chemical interventions that would kill off some of the bacteria, as well as pasteurization, where heat kills off the bacteria but doesn't denature the fluid. So, how did he connect to Jenner? He took Jenner's idea of inoculation and thought that it could be applied to other diseases. And he treated a young boy who'd been bitten by a rabid dog. The boy was actually defending his sister and some other smaller children from the rabid dog and got bit pretty well. And rabies was and still is a death sentence. If it's untreated, rabies will kill you. I believe there's been one documented case in all of history of someone spontaneously beating rabies. So Pasteur took a weakened preparation of the rabies vaccine and injected it into this boy's peritoneum and was actually able to cure him. Now that's important. That's the first time in recorded history someone has actually beat a disease with an intervention. Sure, we can support people through the process of healing, but that's the first time an intervention did all the heavy lifting. So rabies suddenly became curable. Now, Pasteur was an excellent showman and self-promoter, a little bit flamboyant. He's been accused of stealing some ideas from other people. Maybe there's something to that, maybe not. But the fact is, he got results not only because he was a brilliant scientist, but because he was very good at communicating those ideas. Think of Ignaz Semmelweis, the man who figured out that the midwife ward didn't have the mortality that the physician ward did in obstetrics because the midwives were not contaminating their hands through dissection of the bodies that passed away. He could have saved many, many people if he'd been a better communicator. Pasteur had that gift and used it. So there he is, inoculating that small boy, saving him from rabies, and point of fact, that boy became a security officer at the Pasteur Institute and actually held that position up until his death when the Germans invaded Paris. So, in addition to that, Pasteur saved beer, saved wine, saved silk. So yes, best person ever. All right, now, around this time, post-Enlightenment, coming into the modern era, science and we truly do have science and scientists at this point, starts to become critical of medical practice and medical interventions. It starts to see that some of this stuff is just bunk. And this great quote here from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., not to be confused with his son, the Supreme Court Justice, but Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., said, "I firmly believe that if the whole materia medica as now used would be sent to the bottom of the sea, it would be better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes." Now he then went on to say some exceptions to that, such as opium, anesthetics, and things of that nature. But he's talking as a physician. He was an anatomist and physician at Harvard, very well respected, and he actually almost hit on the idea of hand washing as a cure for puerperal fever as well. He got this close to being able to make that jump earlier than Semmelweis. But he saw these problems. And fortunately, chemistry and the burgeoning field of organic chemistry, taking plants and other living substances and extracting distinct and specific chemicals from them, started to become really kind of a force to be reckoned with. So the first organic substance that was synthesized was urea. It was in 1828 by Frederick Wöhler. And that not only allowed organic chemistry to take its first step forward, but also disproved the idea that living things were of an entirely different nature than unliving things. It brought that little vital force to an end. People thinking that living was completely separate from non-living were shown to be incorrect. It's chemicals. I'm chemicals, the floor is chemicals. It's the type of chemicals that make the difference, and how they're organized, I should say. So next up, Claude Bernard and others started looking at specific organic preparations and extracts. He found that curare didn't just affect the whole body, it affected specific places. It affected the neuromuscular junction and stopped muscles from being able to contract willfully. And we finally get pharmacology as we now know it coming into existence. We have extracts from all kinds of plants and animals starting to come on not only the market, but be discovered. So Oswald Schmiederberg, I always mess up his name, Schmiederberg, a Lithuanian, was really the founder of modern pharmacology, had a chair, the first chair of pharmacology at any institute, university, came up with a very authoritative text that was used, and discovered that muscarine was a chemical that would have the same effect as stimulation of the vagus nerve on the heart. So it wasn't just that the vagus nerve was having pneuma travel through it, there was a specific chemical released at the synapse that was doing that. Later on, we had Johns Hopkins pharmacologist, John Abel. He went on and expanded the available list of substances that we'd been able to extract to include epinephrine, histamine, and actually insulin. So insulin was first isolated and synthesized by Abel, and these not only were able to cause physiologic changes in people, they were actually able to treat diseases. Imagine the first time insulin got to be used on someone who was diabetic and suddenly kind of ameliorated those symptoms very quickly. All right, amongst other things were various plant preparations, and cocaine was one of the first. Now cocaine and cocaine and separately derivatives of the poppy plant, opium, heroin, morphine, not only became widely used in medicine, they also became recreationally used. It used to be that you could go into a store and buy cocaine drops or buy morphine drops, give them to the kids when they're teething, and they were widely marketed for a lot of reasons. The first people to look medically at cocaine were actually somebody you've already heard of, Sigmund Freud. Before he came up with psychotherapy and really took off on that route, did an intensive study of cocaine and its effects on people, and he thought it would be a way to wean people off of heroin addiction. Sounds great, right? If you go, when you're looking at substance abuse, getting addicted to something just as bad, no longer on our list of options. But he looked at it in a lot of different ways, but he somehow missed one of its major medical uses, which is as a topical anesthetic. And he mentioned how cocaine could cause numbness to a colleague named Carl Kohler, who's an ophthalmologist. Now take a second and think about an ophthalmologist trying to do surgery on cataracts, the lens, other structures of the eye without anesthetic. Just think about that. You can force someone to keep their arms held together so you can go in after their appendix. You can, bodily restrict them. You can't restrict someone's eye. You just can't do it. So coming up with this topical preparation of cocaine made eye surgery much more effective, much quicker, and much safer all at once. Now we'll talk about its application to surgery in the next talk and some of the unintended consequences of cocaine as a topical anesthetic there. Now, in 1928, Alexander Fleming inadvertently gave us the first pharmaceutical antibiotic. So the bacteriostatic penicillin came about because he was looking at a plate of bacteria and noticed that a spot where it had been kind of compromised by some mold had a little halo with no bacterial growth. The mold was actually putting out penicillin, and it was killing off, or at least not allowing the bacteria to grow. Now, he actually didn't really think much of this. He thought, well, that's interesting, and even though bacteria cause disease, we'll never get this to work in the human body. And he set it aside. Only later, a few years after that, he came back to it and thought it was worth a try to see if penicillin could actually be used in medical treatment. And no surprise, he did. And penicillin was very difficult to synthesize in any substantive quantities initially. But there was a study done with 5 infants who had gonorrhea of the eye, and the penicillin treatments, which at the time were incredibly expensive, got the infection resolved in 4 out of 5 of those kids. So it was actually shown to be very effective. And then, just as the US had entered World War II, there was a massive fire in Boston, and a lot of the victims were treated with penicillin, and the shocking result was that very few of them had any sort of a septic reaction. They didn't develop the typical after effects of having an infection following a burn because their skin couldn't keep bacteria out. And the US Army, having entered World War II, thought this was a big deal and started synthesizing penicillin in massive quantities. And the person responsible for that is up here on screen, Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau. Now let's take a moment. I've gotten through 2.8 of these talks, and there's the first woman we've had on screen, so yay. So Margaret Rousseau came up with synthetic, or was able to mass produce penicillin due to her background in engineering. She also came up with another wartime necessity, synthetic rubber. Instead of having rubber plants be our only source for tires and other things of that nature, she came up with synthetic rubber. So massive, massive American hero. Because we had penicillin on D-Day and subsequently throughout the war, Allied troops had much, much lower casualty rates, especially after the initial engagement, than people in the Axis. So that penicillin was not just a pharmaceutical step forward, it was actually a military secret for a while because it was so effective and gave such a huge boon to the Allied troops. All right, that pretty much takes us up to where we are now. And I want to thank once again Integrative Medicine and AMOPS for sponsoring this talk. Next time will be the history of surgery, which, oh yeah. If you thought it's crazy so far, just wait. Thank you.